Thanks everyone for coming. So my name's Áine Murray and I'm going to go through what are the future metrics for pasture production and utilisation. So just to outline in my talk today, we're going to go through the different farm strategies in achieving these. So in terms of where are we now in terms of current grass production on farms, looking at some of the pasture-based data, doing up a total grass budget then to suit your farm, how to set your stocking rate then based on this grass budget, and how we achieve the targets then through the different seasons. So in this graph here, we have the dry matter production, and it's divided into each season, spring, summer, and autumn, over the last 10 years for a match sample of 250 farms. The farms are represented across 22 counties in Ireland. Each farm did at least 39 farm covers each year, and is stocked at 3 cows per hectare and has a soil fertility of pH 6.4 and index 2s and 3s for P's and K's. So we can see that there is a variability between years in terms of total grass production, and it's how we manage this variability between years. A good year and a bad year could have a difference in total production of up to 20%, which can be difficult to manage then. And we see that over the last 10 years, the average production on these farms was 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. So it's how we try and match this, or how do we budget around this and achieve our targets when there is variability. In terms of the grazing evolution over the last 10 years on these farms, we can see that grazing start date has now moved forward. It's 10 days earlier than it had been. And we also see that the grazing end date is roughly the same. So we are getting more days at grass, which is great. This is the direction we want to go in. And we see that the end of the first rotation and start of the second rotation has moved slightly forward. So it's in the first few days of April now for this set of farms, which may be a bit too early. And we see that the first rotation is now longer as cows are getting out earlier. So in terms of opening farm cover, we need a higher opening farm cover to have enough grass to sustain this longer first rotation. And we saw that on these farms it did increase by 100 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, but it's probably not enough. It needs to be at that minimum of 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare to get enough grass into the diet in that first rotation. And we see that magic day, or the day that growth meets demand, has also moved forward, and your second rotation should somewhere be coinciding with magic day for your farm. In terms of feed allowance per cow then over the last 10 years, we've seen that total feed allowance per cow, so just to clarify that this is the feed allowance per cow at grass for lactation, has increased over the last 10 years to coincide with increasing milk yields. So the demand of cows has increased with increasing milk yields, but the proportion of actual grazed grass being fed has not changed. The grazing allowance, or the allowance of grass being fed to cows, is still at 3.7 tonnes of dry matter per cow, and the increasing demand is coming from increase in concentrate being fed and silage being supplemented. So both of these have actually doubled over the last 10 years. So we're looking at about 800 to 1,000 kilograms of concentrate per cow, and between 400, 500, 600 kilos of silage being supplemented at lactation in order to meet this demand by the cows. So what are the lessons we can learn from these pasture-based farms? We see that average grass growth production is 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare on average, but there is variability year on year between these. And with this, there has been no additional grazed grass allocated per cow. The cows are still being allocated the same amount of grass, and the increase in demand for milk yield has come from supplementary or purchased feeds. Opening farm cover is too low for the first rotation, and that has a knock-on effect into the second rotation and growth from there on. So opening at a sufficient average farm cover to feed cows for the first rotation is really important. And that spring management is key in terms of achieving our grazing targets. So if we look at doing a total feed budget then, This is just, if we look at a system where we're 250 days at grass, feeding 600 kilos of concentrate per cow for the lactation, that would be a total grazed grass utilisation of 3.8 tonnes of dry matter per cow. And this silage includes the dry cow feed. It would be 1.4 tonnes of dry matter per cow. So that's about roughly a tonne during the dry feed and 400 kilos fed during lactation. And that would be a total herbage intake budget of 5.2 tonnes per cow, along with roughly 600 kilos of concentrate then fed per cow. So this is kind of the total feed budget we're working off. And if we try to stock our farm with a whole farm stocking rate to be self-sufficient at this type of a feed budget, so that is an allocation of 15 kilos of dry matter per cow grazed grass intake, so that's what the cow is actually intaking, and then we're talking about an 85% utilisation. So if you're growing 10.5 tonnes on your farm, the maximum you could be stocked at is 1.8 cows per hectare. So that's your total platform. It includes your outblocks and your milking platform. So your outblocks need to be performing just as well as your milking platform. And at a total production of 10.5 tonnes, the maximum you could be stocked at is 1.8 at this level of concentrate supplementation. If you want to, increase or have a buffer on your farm, you would have to reduce this slightly on a year that you've maybe have reduced all your or used up all your silage stocks. For 12.5 tonnes, then the max you could be stocked at whole farm is 2.1. For 14.5 is 2.4, and for 16.5 is 2.7. So if you're somewhere stocked at 2.7 and your total production is somewhere around 12.5 or 14, there's no way your farm could be self-sufficient at this feeding level, at that level of a stocking rate. You are just going to be stocked too high, and you're going to have to either be buying in a lot more concentrate and silage in order to feed the cows. So from that match sample of farms, we saw that the average tonnage was 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. So we know that for them, the maximum they could be stocked at is in and around that 2.1 cows per hectare whole farm. So then how do we, if we have our total herbage production and we set our stocking rate based on our herbage production, how do we achieve the targets then by season? So if there's only 4 targets to remember after today, these should be the ones you should be remembering. We want to reach our peak cover the 1st of October, and you build that, you start building from some point in August or the start of August, depending on your milking platform stocking rate, and you should be building between from around 11 to 1200. If you're on a wet farm, you may not need to build that high. It might only be 900 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, but how you would figure out this for your own farm is based on doing a feed budget for your autumn rotation. Regardless then, everyone should be planning on being at an average farm cover at a minimum of 700 on the 1st of December to be able to turn out in February at 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And your second rotation starts then at some point in April, depending on your farm, at a level of 650 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And Donald's going to go through this afterwards of how to set that date for the start of your second rotation. In terms of the autumn targets then, so the autumn closing rotation is really the start of the grazing season. What you do in the autumn will largely influence what happens next spring and the decisions you can make. So your peak farm cover should occur that 1st of October, and what we really saw this year, that no one was really able to build peak covers in 2024, and now what we see is that there's a lower closing cover. This week on pasture base, average farm cover is at 600 kilos of dry matter per hectare, which is behind that target for the 1st of December, which is only a few days away, of a minimum of 700 to 750 kilograms of dry matter per hectare average farm cover. So it's really important to be closing at this target to have enough grass next spring when your grazed grass is far more valuable to you in the spring than in the autumn. Spring targets then, that opening at an average farm cover of 1,000 minimum. And during the first rotation then, you really need to be monitoring your regrowths to make sure that you're not running down your average farm cover too low. Getting your organic and chemical nitrogen applications out on time to have growth meeting them, have your growth in the first rotation, and to finish that rotation at 650 kilograms of dry matter per hectare average farm cover on the date that suits your farm. And why do we need this to finish the first rotation at this cover? We can see if you open at an average farm cover of 1,000 versus a lower cover of 850 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, this was work done by Mike Egan in Moorepark, we see, and if there was no intervention taken in that first rotation and you end up finishing your first rotation then on a lower farm cover of 400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare instead of the ideal 650, there is subsequent consequences thereafter. We see that there's a 20% reduction in daily growth rate in April and 12% reduction in growth rate from May. So there's a big knock-on effect in not correcting your grazing targets in that first rotation and correcting average farm cover. And one way we can rectify this if you open at a lower farm cover at that 850 is by supplementing silage in that February period. This was also work carried out by Mike Egan and Sarah Walsh in Moorepark, where they supplemented silage at 2 different rates for 2 different periods. And when they supplemented high and low amounts of silage in February, there was no effect on daily milk yield. But then when they continued to supplement silage from Paddy's Day onwards, there was a big effect on daily milk yield. And that had an ongoing effect up until the middle of June, and this was also reflected in the daily protein yield also of the milk. So this was kind of what we've seen happen at the start of 2024 this year, and if you can at all rectify your opening farm cover or your average farm cover in that February period through silage supplementation, this is the time to do it. Moving into the summer then, the main summer targets is achieving your ideal pre-grazing covers of 1,500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And in order to achieve this, you should have a cover per cow of 160 to 190 and be targeting 6 rotations during that April to August period. So 6 rotations would look like a 20-day round for that period. And we see that, going back to that match sample of farms, that farmers are pretty good at achieving this. You know, they've increased the number of rotations, and that has allowed them to be hitting the ideal pre-grazing covers the majority of the time. But then we're just going to go back to mid-season growth versus demand. And this graph here shows the average growth for the last 5 years from about 1,000 farms on pasture base from 2019 to 2023, from the beginning of May until the end of August. And we see that if you have all your land available to you and your minimum stocking rate is 3.1 on your milking platform, I've set demand at 18 kilos total per cow. So if you have a demand here for minimum stocking rate 3.1, you've lots of opportunity to take out surplus bales and silage during that May-June period, and growth tends to be above demand for the majority of the summer period. You don't have to supplement too much, and you also have the opportunity to reseed, and you can start building covers again in that August period. However, if the minimum you can be stocked at on your milking platform during the summer is 3.5, your demand or your growth's only going to meet demand, we see around 40% of the time, and some level of supplementation is going to have to go in, and it's definitely going to have to go in to build covers that autumn period. And then the situation gets far worse at a stocking rate of 4, unless you're growing over 80 kilos a day, which would be very rare cases, that you're really not going to meet your midsummer demand with growth alone, and you're going to have to be supplementing a lot during that mid-season period. So just to conclude then, growth can vary between different years, good years and bad years. There can be 20% of a difference between them. We don't know a good year from bad year until it happens. So how do we insulate ourselves against this? It's about reaching our grazing targets and being able to have a reserve on farms that the good years can insulate the bad years and that we can still achieve our targets year on year. Cows are not being allocated sufficient grass. We can see that from the allocations, and we see that farms that are at 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare are actually stocked at about 2.6 cows per hectare on pasture base. So their stocking rate is not aligned with their grass growth potential, and they're having to supplement heavily. So there is a big dependence on supplementary feed. Grazing stocking rates need to be better aligned in order to have self-sufficient farms. And do you know the targets for your farm? Have you done a feed budget to set these targets? And if you do know your targets, are you able to achieve them? Measuring grass is the first step, and it's decisions that you make after this that help you achieve your grazing targets. So thanks very much. If you have any questions.